What's going on, guys? Mitch here, and today I wanted to do a quick video on the Tarmac SL8 and kind of how it compares with a couple of the other bikes I've been had the good fortune to ride over the last 3 or so years. One being the pink SL7 S-Works model to the left. You've probably seen that one in a number of vlogs. And to the right, you can see the Specialized Aethos Pro, something that I've done, I think, close to 25,000 kilometers on that bike now. So I've got the S-Works SL8 here in front of me. I did want to talk about kind of some comparisons with it and the SL7 as well as the Aethos. Given that I've put, tons of mileage on all three bikes now, and from what I've seen online, a lot of the reviews are kind of first impressions, the first reactions, etc., and it kind of ends there. There might be a long-term review from me down the road once I've put, 5,000-10,000 kilometers on this bike over the next little while. But, I wanted to give you a really good snapshot of the bike from my perspective, from my first, 500 to 1,000 kilometers on the bike, and which I can kind of consider like a short-term review. So let's talk about it and kind of get things kicked off. So obviously, to get things kicked off here, I wanted to do a couple disclaimers. Obviously, this bike is fully kitted out with dura-ace 12-speed, while the other two bikes are force 12-speed and red axis. So there's going to be some differences there. I'm not going to really get into the whole, shifting debate on this versus that, the cassette, the gearing, etc. That's kind of for some other people to kind of talk about. It's not really my shtick, but I do want to talk about more of the frame qualities itself and kind of go off of that, talk about the general ride qualities, how they say this bike is a Venge head tube, for example, and an Aethos rear. More talk about things like that versus, specific components, specific parts, breakdowns of all these little things. But that's kind of my goal for this video, and then to give you guys a recommendation off of that. So as a lot of the literature has discussed, they're kind of saying this bike is a Venge head tube and Aethos rear end. And, a lot of the talk has been around this speed sniffer. The speed sniffer being this gigantic bulge in the head tube that, from the perspective I'm looking at here, is not super noticeable. From one angle it looks not the best, from another it might look a little bit better. From my perspective, to be honest, we're basically just looking at from the head tube up, we are seeing that the front of the head tube is actually sticking out in front of the steer tube, which is running somewhere in the middle here. And that's the exaggeration. When you have spacers on top of the head tube, people think, oh my god, this kind of exaggerates the entire look of the SL8's front. To me, it doesn't really make a difference. I'm a tall guy, I like comfort, and this is not an issue here. The speed sniffer is not an issue. It, to me, looks just fine, and I don't have any issues with it. I guess the big advantage to this head tube would be the fact that, there are some pretty big, substantial, juicy, thick gains to it. In addition to, obviously, looking a little bit thinner, it cuts the wind that much better. And, if you've been watching the vlogs, you've probably seen I've posted some PRs on segments I haven't really been trying at, and even the ones that I have been trying at have been just absolutely blown out of the water. And, it's not necessarily just the head tube, it's the overall package of the bike. Everybody talks about the Venge's head tube, how amazing the Venge's head tube is, how big it is, how aerodynamic it is. To me, the big advantage with the Venge was how stiff it was. There's a lot more material on that head tube. On this bike, there's obviously a lot more head tube material here, but it's the stiffness factor that they were able to achieve by doing that Aethos style layup to the carbon material. It's a very stiff front end of the bike. Now, I wouldn't go as far to say that it's as stiff, but maybe perhaps in conjunction with the Roval Rapide handlebars, there is some added benefit here. And I do notice it because the head tube's cutting through the wind, the bars are cutting through the wind, and, I'm hitting PRs like no tomorrow because of this thing. So it's not just the bar or the head tube that's making this 14-watt claim. It's the entire package all coming together as one. You look at the angle of the computer and how it flows over the integrated bar stem, how smoothly that's done. You know, the old adage or the old saying of that your stem or your bar, they're only as stiff as the stem bolts that are clamping these things together. It really holds true. And when you're removing a lot of that material from here, you're able to lighten up things, which is kind of an overall theme of the bike. But you're able to add that stiffness factor to the overall front end that maybe by not adding a ton to the head tube in material-wise, you're able to kind of retain the Venge's feel to the front end of the bike. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Yes, I agree, the head tube can be a bit of an eyesore at first, but I'm telling you, as you get to know this bike and as you get to kind of ride it, the cone itself actually really grows on you. I really don't mind it, and especially when you're tucked down, you might get a little whiff of it as you're looking down, and you realize compared to the SL7 just how stiff that front end is and how thin the front end looks. It looks really cool, and I thought this was a pretty cool angle to show that off with. So when we're looking at the rear end of this bike, you know, everyone says Aethos rear end, myself included. I wouldn't really go that far. I would say that, you know, the similarities, yes, there's less material in the rear end because the chainstays appear thinner. That's absolutely true, but that's kind of where I would kind of end that conversation. You know, the Aethos is a very floaty bike. Floaty being that it's supple yet firm, if that makes sense. This rear end is very stiff, very power transfer ready, very racy. Even if you look at the chainstays here, they're shaped to provide power transfer and stiffness. They're thicker than the Aethos. Despite looking thin, they're still quite a bit thicker. If we look at the Aethos, they're more rounded and more like a spaghetti noodle. Whereas this, you can kind of see they've retained the shape of the SL7. I don't know what you'd call that, like a trapezoidal or something shape. It's still kind of boxy. It's not round, which tells you that it's trying to retain some up-down tuned motion to the rear end. And I certainly noticed that on the rides. The rear end is still ultra stiff, yet compliant. But it is not nearly as compliant as the Aethos. I would argue it might be a little tiny bit more compliant than the SL7. And I don't know if that's just simply down to the material use, but it is absolutely tuned and ready to go in that it's like a race car just ready to sprint off the line. There's just so much power transfer in this rear end, despite the quote Aethos style to it. That's what I notice. If we're looking at the bottom bracket of the SL8, clearly you can see it is definitely thinner in material. And I'll overlay right now some images of the SL7's bottom bracket from my personal bike to kind of show you what I'm talking about. They've certainly taken material out of this area. There's no doubt about it. But the way they've laid up the chainstays, they've been able to retain the same power transfer. You know, there was some literature on this talking about how they increased the, I think it was like strength to weight ratio by 33%. I think I talked about that earlier. And how, you know, they're still able to provide the same power transfer at a reduced weight. Well, if you think about that, there still should be some level of increased compliance coming from that. So I certainly do notice that, but the power transfer has not been lost in that bottom bracket area. Now, if we're following up from the bottom bracket and we're starting to go up into the seat tube here, we notice we still have a similar, not the same, level of cutout that we've provided here in the seat tube. So a couple things I notice. It's certainly not as exaggerated here, but the entire seat tube itself is smaller, okay? So they talk about that percentage, right? So it is smaller. There is some more compliance being provided to the rider through kind of chatter, which I think more so comes from this seat tube and seat post configuration than anything. That's just my kind of take on things, but it still has that cutout, lots of room for clearance of materials to kind of come through, you know, water, mud, dirt. I hope you're not riding in the mud, but still has that ability to clear things out here. Lots of tire clearance as well, 32 mil. Still lots of room in here to clear anything, water, muck, whatever. You know, I kind of like that they stuck with 32 mil rather than bumping it to say 34, because then if you're running like a 24, 25, 26 tire, it's not going to look like it's just this huge tunnel surrounding it, especially in the fork. It looks ridiculous. So, and you're kind of closing the category off to the enduro riders that want to run, say, 40s or 38s. Because when they claim 32s, yes, you could probably get away with a couple extra mil if you really wanted to. I obviously don't suggest that, but it is nice to have some additional clearance when you do need it. The overall seat post profile has obviously changed, and once again, I'll overlay the SL7 seat post from my bike beside me here through the magic of cinema. But as you can kind of see, it has certainly reduced in both width as well as depth on the post. So, you know, when we talked earlier, that magic rule about the percentage increase while retaining stiffness, whatever, that's just a ratio. So they're able to tune this, right? They take material out of the seat post while kind of maintaining the rear end's stiffness to weight ratio and power transfer figures. And then where do they make up the comfort? Well, they do that in the seat post. It's thinner. It's still a D kind of style to it. So the forward and backwards configuration when you're kind of leaning it or when you're putting power into it, it's still obviously tuned so that it's ultra stiff front and back, which is kind of what you want. But that's where a lot of the material and weight savings is actually coming from, because you're able to cut the weight down in the seat post, which kind of flows all the way down into that seat tube area. And you know, there's no reason, that's a big part of why you're pulling 120 grams out of this frame. So they did include an extra water bottle bolt up here. If you remember the Venge, I believe they had some aerodynamic characteristics that came out and said that when you actually put your bottle down into the lower setting, you actually were able to attain better aerodynamics. For me, the main attraction here is to move my bottle down further, closer to the bottom bracket, which gets the weight lower in the frame. And if you're moving the bike side to side, you're going to actually gain a little bit, it's going to require less energy. You're going to gain some efficiencies there. So I'm running it down in the lower setting, but that's also something that I don't have on either of my other two bikes, which is a nice little feature. Now, the rear end as well, I will say this. A couple weird things. The axle tightness is actually really high, I think, in the manual compared to the SL7, so I don't know what's going on there, or if that's just a typo. It does utilize the Aethos style axle, which is kind of a milled out axle, as well as the derailleur hanger. And I can't really obviously take off the derailleur hanger to show you that, but think of it as a standard derailleur hanger that's kind of just had additional milling to take weight out. Some people, you know, obviously say that's a problem because they're worried that they're going to bend it, break it, etc. But now that, you know, 25,000 kilometers on the Aethos with that same hanger, I'm really not too worried about that. As we can see in the front end here with this fork, they have added a little bit more width to the quote sail effect that this will provide with aerodynamic gain. So what I'm talking about here is basically the depth of the fork from here to here has increased compared to the SL7. So I'll overlay that now and kind of show you what the SL7 looks like on my bike over there, and kind of show you that yes, it is a little bit thinner, and I think that you're getting a little bit more aero profile gain from this alone. Although there may be some gains to be had with the fork in that it has a little bit better tuned aero profile, I will say this review can't all be positive in how everything's the best thing since sliced bread. I think, and I haven't seen this mentioned in any review, there's a bit of a sail that happens here with this bike. So with having a little bit wider of a fork, I find that the front end is a little bit more prone to side wind than the SL7. And in fact, I would say I noticed that on the first ride. It's not a big deterrent. It's just something that I noticed when I've put so many miles on the SL7, both the S-Works behind this bike, as well as the SL7 last year that I had. It was just apparent right away. I go, whoa, I have to control the front end a little bit different here. So yes, the overall vibe of this bike is a clear-cut winner versus the SL7 and the Aethos. I would not say in any way it is a combination of the two from a riding perspective. I would say more than anything, it's kind of a combination of a Venge and an SL7. I hate when people say, oh, the rear end is an Aethos. Well, it's just like, it almost bothers me because it doesn't ride anything like an Aethos on the rear end. Yes, the head tube comparison, fair enough. To me, it's more of a stiffness comparison on the front end of the bike. It absolutely has that, but it certainly doesn't have an Aethos vibe to the rear end. It still has that split-second performance, that snap, that absolute, no oversteer, no understeer, just perfection on geometry that the SL7 maintains. And, it does it at a lighter weight, at I think 120 grams a frame on a 56, which is fantastic. Now, what I do notice, though, is that when it comes to climbing, it has that Aethos vibe to it in the climbing department, which more so stems from the weight side of savings. But, it climbs super, super well. 120 grams, it's almost a quarter pound. You do notice it. And not only do you notice it when you're going up the hill, you notice it when you're reefing that bike side to side, in that you go, wow, when I'm sprinting, I can still put down my same, 1,000 watts or whatever you're normally doing. And yet the side to side is just quicker. So those all out efforts in like a crit type environment, and that need to kind of move the bike left to right, right to left in a pinch, you notice it right away compared to the SL7. And the SL7 is not bad at those things. It's a fantastic bike. But you do notice right away how much lighter this frame is side to side. I think that you'd be absolutely crazy to tell me that you can quantifiably feel the difference in this bike versus the SL7 in terms of the ability to hold speed. I will say this bike, it does on paper hold speed quicker. And I don't know if that's just me. I don't know if it's just something I've noticed, but I do notice on Strava, on my times, it is holding speed a little bit faster. A lot of my workouts are showing, oh, your effort is harder than normal, or faster than normal, or this route is faster than normal on segments that are 50, 60, 70 times through it. I'm noticing those things, so I think that's pretty cool. And it cuts through the wind and holds speeds really, really well, which could be the bar, could be the speed sniffer, could be a number of things, could be nothing, but it's just something that I certainly notice on my rides. So the question is this: should you buy an SL8? Should you get a SL7? Should you get an Aethos? These are all different kind of questions you can ask. I will say this: my times have never been faster on the SL8 than they were on the SL7, which when I got on the SL7 absolutely obliterated the Aethos. From a comfort perspective, the Aethos is going to win hands down all day long. It's a lighter bike, it's a more comfortable bike, it's great for the bike paths where there's a lot of cracks and bumps. It smooths that out. It should be more of an endurance style bike in my opinion, geometry wise. The SL8 is a faster version of the SL7. Not by much, not by, leaps and bounds where it's like jumping off between an Aethos and going to an SL7 where you're like, yep, this bike is way ahead. Like you can tell. It is faster on paper, and it is faster on paper in the right circumstances, in that, I think half the gains are from the bar and stem, and the rest comes from, the speed sniffer, the more aerodynamic fork, the lighter rear end, whatever, doesn't matter. What I do notice more than anything, the 120 grams is a heck of a lot lighter than the SL7, side to side when you're sprinting, and the power transfer is identical to the SL7, whereas the ride characteristics in the seat post, in the seat tube, have certainly improved. So if you're buying it just for the sake of having the faster, better, whatever bike, yeah, we can debate all day long at how much that difference is really going to be like. What you'll be buying this bike for is the overall improved weight, the ability to climb a little bit better, right? It's kind of similar to the Aethos in that regard. But more than anything, the side-to-side throwability of the weight and the improved comfort of the rear end versus the SL7, in my opinion, which was not uncomfortable, but it's just a 4-year model improvement. It's not, changing the world. It's just gradually making it a little bit better. At the end of the day, it's still a race bike. It's still lightning quick. It's still it's not made for ultra comfort, but you can certainly do, those big, long 100+ K rides on it and not have any issues at the end of the day. I've done multiples. It's absolutely fine. you don't have an issue with it. It's, you know, it has the right angles to both do crits as well as some endurance rides. You know, is it my top choice if I'm going to want to go for a 200K-er? I don't know. Can it do it? Absolutely. But is it more designed for the, you know, those heavy level, you know, endurance rides of those 100 miles where its top end performance is critical, or a crit race? Absolutely. So not an issue there from my perspective. So what should you do? Well, it's totally up to you. To me, you know, a SL7 S-Works is, I think, heavier than an SL8 standard frame. So, you know what? I think the SL8 standard, you know, there isn't a comp yet, Expert Pro models offer tremendous value. They're higher performing, I'd say, than the S-Works SL7. You know, to the top end rider that wants every single ounce of either performance or technology, then you know what, the S-Works SL8 is going to take another, I can't recall, maybe 100 grams off of that, something like that, or 80 grams. It's not huge, but it's enough that, you know, you still retain the same ride quality and everything like that. It's just a little bit more money. So I think in either case, over SL7 or SL8, personally, well, I would go SL8 because I want the best performance. I'm noticing an improvement in speed. I'm noticing an improvement in comfort. In all my Strava segments are improved. So, you know, it is quantifiably better. It is technically better. Whether you notice it out on the road, I don't know, you know. You can kind of go any direction with this. But from my perspective, it's a clear-cut winner between the two. And the Aethos at this point, I really don't see a need for it. For me, myself, because now you've got an SL8 that is it's stepping on the toes of the Aethos because of how light the bike is. The gap between the two isn't what it used to be. So that's kind of what I would take away from this. Hopefully that provided you with enough information where you can kind of, you know, figure things out for yourself. You know, I'm not here to sell you bikes. I'm here to provide you with my opinion of the SL8 versus the SL7 and the Aethos. Totally up to you what you want to do, but the numbers don't lie, and I think this is a tremendous bike. So, you know, if you can get an SL7 at half the price, I don't think you're getting half the performance, anything like that. So, you know, balls in your court there, but that's kind of what I think. Anyway, guys, thanks for stopping by. Thanks for checking out the bike, and thanks for watching the vlogs, the reviews, all that stuff. I really do appreciate it. Continue leaving comments, hit that bell button, and you know, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thanks for stopping by, guys, and I will see you on the next one, okay? Cheers, and we'll see you out there. Bye.